Dear citizen advocacy colleagues, greetings from New Salem, Massachusetts. I wish I could be there with you, but alas, that is not the case. So I thought about what to say in a few minutes to you all that might be helpful, and here goes. In the context of citizen advocacy, it's always seemed to me that the goal was many good relationships, in which one partner was a vulnerable person, that's the protege in citizen advocacy talk, and the other was a valued person called the advocate, who was a good match with the protege. While the relationships arranged and supported by a citizen advocacy program have a range of characteristics and benefits for all involved parties, the focus, as I understand it, is on the best interests of the protege. In CAPE by O'Brien and Wolfensberger, this idea is captured for me in the idea of primary advocate loyalty to protege. All the elements of the citizen advocacy program model, the principles, the key activities, the program governance, and funding structures are tailored to increase the likelihood that the relationships supported will be good, especially good for the protege. A couple of times I've used the word good and spoken about a good match, a good relationship, to describe the kinds of relationships that a citizen advocacy program seeks to initiate and support. What makes for a good relationship in citizen advocacy? It's a topic that's worth talking about with board members, at gatherings of coordinators, and with others involved in and around citizen advocacy. A few words that come quickly to mind for me and offered in no particular order are freely given, independent, belonging or really owned by the participants in the relationship, mutually beneficial, meaningful, relevant, long-term, with a consciousness of vulnerability and a preparation for advocacy, relationships that are integrative, where there's interpersonal identification, commitment, presence in each other's lives, and caring. Not all these things will be part of every relationship initiated and supported by a citizen advocacy program. However, if good relationships are to be the goal of the program, then these relationship elements are things to think about, to work towards in recruiting, orienting, matching, and supporting relationships. I think, really I know, that good, freely given relationships are an important thing for all people, especially so for people with disabilities. This is true in part because the reality of their impairment, almost by definition, suggests a greater dependence on others for some kind of support, and also because people with disabilities are marginalized, they're vulnerable. Many people use the word devaluation to capture these points about marginalization, vulnerability, wounding, a term that more fully describes disabled people's situation than does just vulnerability or marginalization. A thing for all of us to remember is that hardly anyone, other than citizen advocacy programs, are effectively fostering the kinds of good relationships that I've been talking about. A few other things I've heard of, like Big Brother, Big Sister, and Best Buddies here in the US, do foster some one-to-one relationships, but those tend to be under staff supervision and are often short-term relationships. Lots of progressive human service programs talk about and work on social integration. They tend to call it inclusion these days, at least around here. But my conclusion about these efforts is that few freely given, individually committed relationships emerge from even the most thoughtful of these integration efforts. What sometimes gets achieved for people are valued roles, acceptance, and sometimes a sense of belonging. And these are all good things. However, for committed relationships to emerge from these kinds of efforts, some additional effort, really some kind of an invitation to relationship, has to come from somewhere. My observation is that the invitation to relationship occurs only rarely, especially for people who are more impaired or more deeply devalued or marginalized for some other reason. I do know one place where, for people who end up being largely friendless with just relationships with paid staff people, sometimes with family, not always, the one place where that kind of invitation happens is from citizen advocacy programs, from a citizen advocacy program that is fulfilling its mission as the initiator and supporter of good relationships. While this talk about the importance of relationships being freely given, can't staff be hired to do whatever needs to be done for a person to get by? Shouldn't family love and support be enough? While good family support and good support from paid workers is wonderful, we should acknowledge that there are inherent limitations in these kinds of relationships. I understand this clearly when I think about how my life would be if only family members and paid staff were personally engaged with me. While such relationships are wonderful, life with only these kinds of relationships would be quite limited. Further, there's the reality that not all families are a positive presence in a person's life, and also the reality that parents, who are the primary unpaid supporters of many people with disabilities, they age, and the reality, too, that few service workers make the kind of enduring relationship commitments that we strive for in our citizen advocacy work. The basic idea of citizen advocacy is simple. You recruit, orient, and match people, and then support their relationship. I'm sure this gathering of citizen advocacy people will have lots of talk about how to do these things well. And of course, doing the work well increases the likelihood of many good relationships. That should be the focus of our conversation and our work. But then let's step back for a minute. Is it really such a simple idea? If it's so simple, then why doesn't more good citizen advocacy work, other freely given relationship building kinds of work that's kind of related to citizen advocacy, why doesn't more get done? Why is it that so few people who have disabilities end up having freely given relationships outside of the disability community and their families? Well, for one thing, the whole business of relationships is in general hard for all of us. On top of that, it's often the case that a person with a disability needs more and different kinds of support. For people not familiar with giving such supports, this reality can be off-putting. People might not be comfortable with the kind of support that's required. Other times, people are concerned that they might do harm by not doing things right. And then on top of all this is devaluation, the negative attitudes towards people with disabilities. All of this sets others to keep a distance. And that keeping of a distance can be from one, well, just, kind of being polite and just keeping some relationship distance, not getting too engaged with people, all the way up to, or maybe I should say down to, outright rejection. We come to rely on the professionals and the programs to provide the needed support and even the needed relationships for people. And this pattern is rarely critiqued. These things, taken together, help explain, in large part, why so few people with disabilities have freely given relationships other than with family. And it's a fact that people with disabilities don't often invite others into relationships. And it's also another fact that others rarely make that invitation to folks with disabilities. It seems to me that if these are indeed the circumstances around freely given relationships, around that possibility, then either some third party takes on the role of making the invitation, or on the other hand, we just accept the fact that those people won't have freely given relationships other than with family members sometimes and with others with disabilities. That sounds like a situation around people with disabilities. If they really could benefit from freely given relationships, it calls for something like citizen advocacy. And that is the focus of our gathering here. Focusing on citizen advocacy, we have lots of experience about the challenges and struggles there. Just having a citizen advocacy program that does its basic work and stays focused on relationship building is hard. And I frankly think it's getting harder for several reasons. First, it's hard to recruit and develop coordinators who are matchmakers and relationship supporters, and then to keep them doing this effectively in spite of how hard the job is. On top of that, managing all the other business of a small nonprofit is hard. Sometimes, in many ways, not as hard as matchmaking. It can almost become a distraction sometimes, but it does need to be tended to. Then, on top of that, it's hard to recruit and develop board members who effectively support coordinators and tend to a board's administrative and financial business as well. And then on top of all that, it's hard to get funding that allows the citizen advocacy program to focus on its matchmaking and support mission. So often, other kinds of requirements and pressures come into play that distract from or can even undermine the matchmaking mission. So, if a program, really the program leadership, with a coordinator who's a matchmaker and a board that supports its work, then since we're meddling in people's lives, once matchmaking starts to happen, I think we're really obligated to try and do the work well. To my mind, that's where we need to study and strive to follow the 5 defining principles, to effectively carry out all 7 of the 7 key activities, and support all of this with effective funding and governance structures. The 3 sections of CAPE, that Citizen Advocacy Program Evaluation, provide clear instruction on how these things might be done well. I'm sure other parts of this conference will address these fundamentals, so I just list them out here. So, you got all this in place. You got a program, you got a matchmaker, you got a board, you got funding, you're making matches. Now there's a citizen advocacy program that's doing the hard work of matchmaking and relationship support, and it's striving to do the work well. I guess, if you're found, that it's time to just relax and operate the program. Well, I've not found that to be the case. More challenges arise, and because we're dealing with people and relationships and all the business of good relationships, all kinds of dilemmas keep coming up. This requires us to begin considering a host of deep questions. These dilemmas are worth thinking about with the goal of good relationships firmly in mind. We shouldn't be consumed by them, but they're important things to think about. So here's some of the questions, some of the dilemmas in striving to do citizen advocacy work well that come to me as I'm preparing this presentation. Much of this is based on what I've learned from others, Dr. Wolfensberger, others involved with citizen advocacy over all these years, who I've had the opportunity to spend time with. But more of these experiences, more of these ideas are based on experiences that I've had in making matches and in supporting relationships a few hundred times. One of my more recent questions is just what are we saying when we talk about people's gifts, especially if we focus exclusively on people's gifts? This is certainly image enhancing, so from a SRV perspective, it's a good thing to do. But do we mean that people's gifts are the reason why others would enter into relationship with them? In the language that sometimes gets used in US politics these days, we call these kinds of relationships transactional. And what that means is that people get involved with each other because they figure they're going to get something out of it, They're going to use the other person or use the relationship. An interesting take on this would be to think that people's limitations, their support needs, the needs that come from the fact of their disability and also from the pattern of hurtful life experiences from the devaluation, that their support needs are actually a gift that they bring. And that gift is an invitation to others to enter into supportive relationships with them. If addressing another's needs is the reason for getting engaged or a main reason for getting engaged, then altruism, a desire to be helpful to others, actually becomes the motivation. Years ago, a neighbor asked me why a person would reach out to be helpful to a person with a disability. Said another way, what kinds of values might a person hold that would motivate something like altruism, even to the extent of causing the advocate, the helper, to struggle and even suffer some? On top of this, it's a fact that many people who become advocates face some real challenges. Consider the fact that initiating good relationships requires the Citizen Advocacy Office to tell the truth about what the relationship is likely to entail. If some of the truth is reporting difficulties that can come from many different sources, of course, but difficulties in the relationship, then what motivates people to say yes to being advocates, board members, coordinators, funders, and so on? Adam Hildebrand, known as Adam in Australia, AJ around the US, he's passed away now, is a coordinator with Citizen Advocacy Program in Beaver, Pennsylvania. He suggested 5 possibilities that would motivate people to be altruistic, to become engaged with this kind of other-centered offering of support, assistance, guidance, advocacy, to be helpful to people. And these five just listed out here are religious or other kind of moral teachings. It could come from secular sources as well. Passion for social justice, a desire to build community and with relationships that cut across lines of difference, being a part of community building, the enrichment from relationships, from that possibility. And then the final point here, a desire to help others traveling a hard road um, that a person is on themselves, the desire to be helpful to others in a similar spot. I've sometimes had the chance to have deep conversations with advocates, board members, and others about these potential motivators for citizen advocacy engagement. However, I've concluded that what motivates people to say yes, to be altruistic, is their business and not mine. In my matchmaking days, I was pleased to have board members and find advocates who had one or several of these motivations, but all of them were present in some of the board members who worked with me. As I've said, citizen advocacy is the business of making and supporting good relationships. I've concluded that people's values and motivations are their business, so long as they contribute towards good relationships. Another good thing to be clear about are the key objectives in doing the work well towards the goal of many good relationships of the kind that I've been talking about here. What are we trying to get to happen in the relationships that emerge out of our work? I remember, not precisely, I'm sorry, ideas about this that came from Mitchell Peters, a man from Western Australia who worked as a citizen advocacy coordinator several years ago. As I remember it, Mitchell suggested that there were four things that citizen advocacy is looking to get done, and it's fostering and supporting good relationships. And they're noted here, pretty basic things. One is to recruit relationship participants. You got to recruit. It's necessary if there to be people with whom matches might be made. And then another is to make matches, to bring proteges and advocates into relationship with each other. A third is to support those relationships so that they're likely to endure. Addressing proteges' relationships needs for enduring continuity in relationships. And the fourth is to potentiate, I've always liked that word, to potentiate advocacy. That is to, in addressing proteges' needs related to protection and advocacy, protection and harm, advocacy for more opportunities, to do the work in a way that makes it more likely that the advocate will actually advocate, speak up for the person. So another question I always wonder about with citizen advocacy, and I've heard discussions struggle about this, and over the years and across the citizen advocacy movement, is the primary goal for relationship or for integration or for action? Is it for one of these or is it for all of these? What is it, And then, related to that, how much do we focus on relationships lasting or on any one of these? Does it undermine the likelihood that we will focus in some real depth in the other areas as well? Depending on how we answer such questions, we might find ourselves firing advocates who don't do what we see the protege as needing. And I've heard of that happening. On the other hand, we might avoid challenging advocates in any way at all, just so long as the relationship is ongoing. Is there some balance between these two? How does the protege situation, which of course will change over time if the relationship endures, shape what we hope will happen and how we will provide support? And of course, the protege situation, how do we come to understand their situation, come to understand what's in their best interests? And this starting with protege recruitment, extending all the way through all the work we do in terms of recruiting advocates, orienting, making matches, spreading support in multiple different ways to the enduring relationships. The question of how do we figure out or who decides what's in a protege's best interest? Is this something that we should just ask the protege, what do you need? What do you want? And then that's what we would invite and support advocates to do? Or do we say to the person's family the same question? Do they decide? Or should we say that to their human service program? Or should this be something the Citizen Advocacy Office decides? Or is it something the advocate should figure out all on their own? The way we answer this question is going to shape kind of how we function as a citizen advocacy office, how we engage with proteges and then primarily advocates when we're offering support? How do we engage in ways that will increase the likelihood of there being a good relationship? Trying to answer all these subtleties is enough to drive me to distraction, and probably most of you all as well. It's developmental for those of us involved with citizen advocacy to learn, reflect, discuss, and engage with these kinds of questions. But before any of these deeper things, each of us has to decide to do citizen advocacy, even though it's hard. After we decide, then we actually have to do it and have a program that can and does responsibly make matches and support relationships. And then we have to decide whether to stay with it, even though it never really gets very far back from the edge of collapse, even though it continues to be hard. For me personally, when I got to this stage, I really wondered if it was worth the effort to make a few matches in a small rural community in Massachusetts. Just in our little towns, 26,000 people, there are so many isolated, wounded, and vulnerable people. Are we making even a significant dent in the issue here? And does this approach of two people, one relationship at a time, do anything significant? And then in a broader scale, there's so few citizen advocacy programs in the whole world, even good citizen advocacy work resulting in a reasonable number of good relationships doesn't seem to be doing much to address the underlying problems of devaluation, wounding, and vulnerability, and loneliness in any large-scale way. There must be something better to do. And on top of that, overall, it seems to me, in fact, that things seem to be getting worse for people with disabilities and not getting better. So for me, at that point, to know, and really in an ongoing way, is it worth all this effort to do the hard thing? Is there value in bringing a few glimpses of relationship light into the relationship darkness experienced by so many people with disabilities? But then on the other hand, if there are no glimpses of light, the light that does come from freely given caring, then some people who might have found meaning in being in each other's lives will not have that chance. Other people who might have seen that light and perhaps been moved to reach out to others in need will not have an example to look to open up that possibility. Communities that might have been touched by several or even many inspiring stories will not have the examples of neighborly caring that emerge from effective citizen advocacy work. Service workers and even service systems that might have been challenged by the presence and the deep significance of freely given relationship and advocacy will not be confronted. We can know that without citizen advocacy programs, there will be fewer glimpses of light, of freely given neighborly caring, of altruism, tens of thousands over the 50 years. We can know that the kinds of fruits mentioned above will not be available to the people who could benefit from them. Yes, even managing the basics of us having a citizen advocacy program is hard. Yes, trying to do it well is even harder. Yes, staying the course is hard when there are all kinds of distractions and pressures to go do something else. Yes, we will find ourselves being challenged as we encounter the deeper questions that I spoke about just a couple minutes ago. Why bother with all this hassle? Citizen advocacy will not change the world, at least not in big, noticeable ways, and especially not in the short term. But yes, citizen advocacy, really the relationships that the programs call forth and support, may make a huge difference. Who knows? Yes, it is worth making the effort, the valid effort, to do the hard work of citizen advocacy program leadership. I think back for myself about how I began to have freely given, not just paid engagements with disabled people, other than the folks with disabilities within my family. My work had led me to the conclusion that I needed to walk the walk of reaching out, being engaged with others, of being altruistic, before I could talk the talk about relationship building. I spoke to my pastor about this, and he told me about this fellow, Lawrence, pictured here, from our local nursing home. Lawrence wanted a ride to church on Sundays. For almost 20 years, Lawrence rode to church with us and became our church companion and our companion for others' adventures as well. He became part of our lives. I believe that this one relationship that started with two people brought forth much good fruit, making it worthwhile. Here's a few things of my thoughts on this. For Lawrence, he got a friend, his friend's family, and re-involvement with his church. He got a pancake breakfast, served with beer of all things, on many occasions in our home. He had reasons to go on living, protection from some of the bad things that might have happened to him. Good fruits for Lawrence. For me, I got a friend who motivated me to get to church, provided many adventures. We called them Lawrence stories at home, like the time he told the dean of the local theological school that he waved his arms too much when he was preaching. Sometimes our role was to smooth things over. Beyond that, our relationship did give me bona fides in my work. Good fruit for me. I think there was good fruit for my family too. For just one example, our youngest wrote his college application essay about Lawrence. He titled it 3 Hours for a Lifetime and started it off by noting that Lawrence had the privilege of being a member of our family before Luke was born. Good fruit for my family. I think there was good fruit for our church. From what I've observed and heard from others, we're pretty unusual in the way that we managed to include a reasonable number of people with troubles into the ongoing life of the church in valued roles, like choir member, deacon, liturgist, and to do so in ways that avoid the common practice of setting up special, separate programs for those special people. Good fruit for my church, and maybe some other churches who hear about us too. I think there was good fruit for our community. The relationship that grew and endured between Lawrence and me and others who came to be involved with us was a key foundation for my role in starting North Quabbin Citizen Advocacy, a program that's now made about 400 matches. Nate Johnson took over for me as matchmaker there when I retired from my day job a couple of years ago. Matches are still getting made and relationships are still being supported. It's an article of faith for me that these relationships bring good fruit to our rural community and maybe some other communities as well who hear about us. And then, to some extent, not very visible, but who knows how important, I think there is a good fruit on a wider stage, too. I can't see the ways that Lawrence has changed the world in any measurable sense, but then who really knows? Because, see, it's just one story. But then I remember what Dr. Wolfensberger wrote about the importance of just the one stories, really. Dr. Wolfensberger wrote, and something that I've often included in my writing, in my thinking about and teaching about citizen advocacy, he wrote, there are many people, especially wounded and handicapped people, who do not have viable, relatively unconditional, one-to-one supportive relationships. If people are no longer willing to engage in those kinds of relationships, laws can be passed, unlimited funds can be allocated, and still nothing will work. If individual citizens on a personal basis do not bind the wounds of the sick, do not give bread to the hungry, do not console the brokenhearted and visit the imprisoned, do not liberate the captives of oppression, and do not bury the dead, then nothing will work. I hope that Lawrence and I made a bit of contribution toward the possibility that in our messy, struggling world, some things may actually still work for our devalued, wounded, vulnerable brothers and sisters. I hope that he and I, and all the others over the years who've responded to the invitation from citizen advocacy, will contribute to what is needed for things to actually work. So, how to conclude my rambling presentation to my citizen advocacy colleagues? Well, in my view, it's the relationships that bring forth the good fruit. If that's true, then at the core of doing citizen advocacy work is making matches and then supporting relationships. Dealing with all the other challenges in doing the work well is wasted effort if no matches get made. If matches do get made, then it becomes worth the hassle and effort to support them and to keep making more. Over time, and really for as long as matches keep getting made and relationships supported, it becomes a challenge to do the work better and better, so that the matches that do get made are more likely to lead to good relationships. But where does this start? So here's my central suggestion, request, guidance, advice, or whatever you want to call it. Go make matches. Start by recruiting proteges and advocates. Make matches. Okay, it's hard, but it is really important on many levels. It's important work, and it's not being done much at all by others. You all have the opportunities in the roles that you hold with citizen advocacy to help make matches. Now all we have to do is go and do it, and then to keep on doing it, and to keep on striving to do it better. Thanks for your time and attention.
You've stunned us with your breadth of the good fruits. Your conclusion is that we, because those fruits make a difference in the lives of the people in the relationship both ways. Would you like to elaborate on what you've just said again?
Well, I have a couple thoughts. One is that my involvement with Lawrence is it didn't start out being altruistic. In a sense, reaching out to Lawrence, I was compensated for that by getting standing in order to do my work. I think sometimes that the Lawrence and I got past my selfish reasons for getting to know him, and that's where the good fruit actually came from. When it stopped being I was doing it for me, and it became I was doing it for him and for us. That's one. Heather talked about who was it? I think it was Robin and Marcia. Two youngsters who met 40 years ago when they were doing what sounded like a pretty not good citizen advocacy practice by involving a whole bunch of students. And we all know what happens to students when they leave college, but to see a match got made and it lasted for 40 years. And it makes me think of something John O'Brien said at one point in time that I think he said this, and this is, I hope I'm accurate, that one of the reasons he liked citizen advocacy was that even when you didn't do the work very well, when you invited people to enter into each other's lives out of the goodness of their hearts and to make a commitment to each other, that it was very unlikely that you'd do any harm. And sometimes things of great beauty would emerge. And that's, I hold on to that. And when I say to you, make matches, that don't get paralyzed by saying, oh, I've got to do this perfectly right. Otherwise, I'm not even going to try, make matches. We're inviting people to care about each other, and I think that's a good thing. I think people caring about each other it's about one of the best things in the world.
Is Lawrence still alive?
Lawrence passed away about 20 years ago now. He rode to church with us on Sundays for 20 years. We had some medical adventures at the end. I guess, one thing that I would, there's a lot of fine points, but that a lot of what we did for Lawrence, it wasn't really advocacy. It was just practical help, giving him a ride to church on Sundays and, stopping at the grocery store so he could at the convenience store so he could buy goodies to smuggle into the nursing home for the week ahead. That's just practical support, But there was also advocacy that, the time that they took him, they wanted him to have a hernia operation. And I was the person who brought him to the hospital. And that when the doctors, his heart almost stopped when he was on the operating table. And even though I had no legal standing, the doctors didn't have anybody else to ask what they should do. And when they came and they said to me, well, what do you think we should do? And I said, I think you should give him, a pacemaker, and that when Lawrence ripped the cords out of the temporary pacemaker, I said, I think you should give him like a regular pacemaker. So that's advocacy when I was speaking up to a third party on Lawrence's behalf, or when I asked somebody who I knew who worked in the nursing home to try and get the dentist to actually look at Lawrence because he wasn't eating right because his mouth hurt. Speaking up to third parties, that's what advocacy is. A lot of what happened with Lawrence and us was just practical help and really relational. It's I have so many memories. One time he told me that I was the best friend he'd ever had. And when I think back on it at that point in time, he probably wouldn't have made my top 10. So what a lesson about devaluation, that the kind of the minimal friend that I was to him was the best friend he'd ever had. What a sad testimony about what life is like for our brothers and sisters with disabilities. Anyhow, that's enough.
Thanks, Tom, for joining us. Really wonderful to have you here for this.
Well, thanks for having me. I hope that this was useful. That what my words will contribute towards there being more good relationships.